Welcome to RUSI. I think many familiar faces and some not so familiar faces. First of all, this sort of formal. This meeting's on the record, so there's no off-the-record sections. It's based significantly on a book by Andrew, which is not solely about this. It's about particular parts of this book, this meeting, but the book's here. And you just got to, when you're an academic like me, you have to congratulate the publishers on getting a book out at a good time that deals with the organisation of Ministry of Defence just as the Ministry is thinking about that. So that's quite an amazing thing to do. Andrew's work, big work, includes a huge amount of research, both on foreign governments' experiences with organisation of defence, and also the evolution of British attitudes and thinking about the topic. So we're obviously focused on today, but I do want to commend to you from the beginning that there's a large amount of work behind this. Now, just to introduce very quickly our two speakers. Well, I suppose myself. I'm Trevor Taylor. I had a Defence Industries and Society programme here. I looked at defence management issues for quite a long time. And though they didn't do anything that I liked, my name is in the back of the Levine Review. So I don't know whether that's a curse or not. There is an Andrew Curtis that's a star on TikTok. This is a different one. And Andrew did 35 years in the Air Force, retired when he was doing logistics at a senior level in the Ministry of Defence, so he has good insight into how the ministry works. He then did a PhD at King's College, and he's now one of the Associate Fellows here at RUSI. Will, so many of you know Will Jessett, a long-time civil servant in MOD, finished his career, I think, as Director of Strategic Planning. He's now associated with King's as a visiting professor and with Exeter at university. He's a senior associate fellow here. He's also a consultant. He's a man of many parts, but again, somebody with really good experience and knowledge of how defence actually managed in practice. So what I'm going to do, I ask Andrew a simple question to allow him to say what he wants to say, and something I'll ask Will a question, and then turn it over to the audience as much as possible. I've got reserved questions that I think ought to be answered, but I would like to leave it to the audience to get your views. And we must finish by 6 o'clock, when you're all invited to go for a drink upstairs, if you can manage that. And last thing, if there's a fire, that's a way out, and there's another way out the way you came in. But we don't anticipate a fire alarm or anything of that nature. So with that quick introduction, Andrew, the dolly question I bowled at you is can you tell us first about the focus of your research and particularly why you were drawn to the topic? Because I know that this is not a topic which automatically appeals to many people. So this is your chance to tell us what you'd like to tell the audience here.
And I'm going to do it from up here because it's slightly less scary up here, but only slightly. Trevor, thanks, and obviously thanks to RUSI for hosting the event. But also, I think the biggest thank you is to all of you for coming out on a cold and wet Tuesday evening, dodging the farmers and making it here. So thank you very much for that. I've been doing this research now for almost 3 years, and I'm pretty confident that research has uncovered most of the questions around defence management, but I know full well I don't have all of the answers. I like to say that every day is a school day, so I'm looking forward to the discussion with Trevor and Will, but actually I'm also looking forward to learning from you all during the questions and answers. The sort of driver behind this research, if I sort of look at it honestly, was bumping up against so many of these issues while I was serving. And as I look around and see sort of serving and retired people in the audience, I suspect that a lot of people will say the same thing. And so that's what drove me to do the research and to get to the position that I'm at today. What I want to do, just for a couple of minutes, if you'll indulge me, is to just talk a little bit about the aims and the purpose of the book and the central thesis of that, because it's very relevant, I think, to what's going on in the SDR, certainly with regard to the sort of the reform elements of the SDR. So aims and purpose. The aims of the book is to identify what's wrong specifically with the management of defence and present some evidence-based proposals to fix it. And I say right at the very start that those proposals are offered as a way to improve the management of defence. They're not necessarily the way. The purpose is to demonstrate the compelling need for reform and to stimulate discussion about how best to go about that. So I have offered some thoughts within the book, and I'm sure that we'll get onto some of those later. But the reason for that is to start the debate. Actually, if defence can be reformed by not using any of the ideas in the book, but it is still made better, why wouldn't you do that? Personally, I'm not sure that it can be, but I'm not wedded to all of those ideas. They are thrown out, if you like, as a start point. So the book traces the history of defence reform. It considers how defence management is currently undertaken, and it identifies future changes in the delivery of military effect. And the reason it does that is because, in my very simple view, defence does two things. It delivers military effect and it manages the business of defence. So delivering military effect, doing harm to the king's enemies and blowing up their stuff, managing the business of defence, all of those things that you have to do to enable defence to deliver military effect. And of course, if you're going to change military effect, and we all know with multi-domain integration, integrated operating concept, and the lessons from Ukraine, that the delivery of military effect is changing. So why wouldn't you then look at the management of defence to make sure that you are doing it in the right way? So the book does that. It then presents a series of case studies. In particular, it looks at Canadian unification, it looks at the US Marine Corps, and it looks at modern defence forces. And I chose the Bundeswehr and the Australian Defence Force to do that. And the idea being that you can draw comparisons and you can pick out lessons learnt that you can then apply to potential solutions that might make UK defence better. So that, if you like, that's the aim and the purpose. So the final thing, if you'll allow me, Trevor, before I sort of hand it back to you, is to outline the book's main thesis. So the research tells me that over the last 70 years, defence reform initiatives have consistently failed to meet their objectives. Okay? Probably everybody could know that without doing the research. The follow-on from that is to identify the significant reasons why. And I feel that there are two of those. The first one of those is the failure of politicians to provide sufficient direction and oversight. The second reason is the power and the influence of the single services. And that power and influence enables them to resist the change that they don't believe is beneficial to them. And I'll just drill down a little bit into both of those. So if you look at the political angle, go back to 2015 general election, Philip Hammond says, there are no votes in defence. And there aren't. We know that politicians rarely get agitated about issues that the public isn't bothered about. So we end up with a sort of chicken and egg dilemma. Traditionally, governments don't get serious about defence because the public doesn't see it as an issue, but the public won't see it as an issue until the government convinces them that it is. So how do you sort that out? And just to give an example of how low defence is on the list of priorities in general, go back to 2010. In 2010, over 100 UK service personnel lost their lives in Afghanistan. In 2010, defence was consistently at the bottom of the voters' list of concerns during the general election. So the year when the UK was probably most focused on military activity, it was still the bottom of voters' issues. So that's the political bit. The power and the influence of the single service is perhaps a little bit more contentious. And I argue that there are two reasons for this. The first one is that the services own the resources, people, budgets in general. Nobody joins defence. Everybody joins the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force. That's where their loyalty lies. And those are the organisations that promote them and that post them. John Healey talks about the need for one defence, but we don't have one defence. We have 3 institutional stovepipes. And you end up with the people, regardless of where they are serving, always keeping at least one eye on their service. And that's because their service posts them and their service promotes them. Resources, the other resources is budgets. And as a result of Levine and as a result of new management strategy, those of you who can think back to the mid-80s and when top-level budgets were introduced, the services own most of the budgets now. Not all, but they have their hand on a significant amount of the budgets. So they have the resources. The other thing that they have is what I call the warfighting imperative argument. And this is a little bit more difficult to explain, but basically, the services are the only organisations within the UK legally allowed to deliver violence on behalf of the nations, on the behalf of the nation. They are the specialists. If you want to drop bombs on people, you call for the Air Force. If you want to go and hold ground, you call on the Army. That's where the knowledge is. That's where the practical experience is. There's an American social theorist, Andrew Abbott, wrote a book called The System of Professions. And he looked at professional organisations, doctors, lawyers, solicitors. And he basically said, these organisations manage themselves. They teach themselves, they discipline themselves. They're a closed shop. If you want to go and seek legal advice, you have to go and speak to a solicitor. If you're ill, you have to go to a doctor. The services are in that space. The services are professions in their own right, but defence isn't. So defence doesn't own the warfighting imperative argument. The services do, because they are the ones that have that knowledge and experience within their operational domains. And they use that argument when discussions are being held over balance of investment decisions. In fact, they use that argument whenever they can to get what it is that they want within defence. Now, I'm not saying that everything that a single service wants is not what defence needs. That's patently untrue. But there are times when priorities differ, and that's where the problems start. So for me, the power and the authority of the single services boil down to those issues. They own the people and resources, they own the resources, the people and the budgets, and they are able to use that warfighting imperative argument for their benefit. And so the argument, my argument, is that until the government faces up to its Hobbesian responsibilities, and until that power and authority, that power and influence of the single services is suitably restrained, no defence reform initiative is going to be entirely successful. But I also think that there's no silver bullet to reform defence. What's needed is a series of changes. But in the vanguard of that change programme must be measures that tackle those two issues. You've got to start off addressing those government responsibilities and the single service power and influence. Because if you don't do that, all you'll do is repeat the lessons of history, and you will deliver a series of defence reforms that will go the way of all the predecessors. There will be some change, there will be some improvements, but you will not solve the problems. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of those issues in the Q&A, but I'll leave it there, Trevor, and hand it back to you.
Well, you've had a chance. First of all, you've had significant experience of management in defence, but also you've had a chance to look at the book that Andrew wrote and some of the findings that we'll hear more about as we go through. The book's got quite full endorsement, incidentally, from Sir Richard Barron's in the preface, which, those of you following the Defence Review know that Sir Richard's got a pretty prominent role in advising the government on what should go in. My question to you, Will, is first of all, what's your view on the need for change in the MOD, and then any comments you have about the suitability of Andrew's prescriptions?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Trevor. Well, evening, everybody. So a couple of points just to start off with. I mean, first, to congratulate Andrew for the research. This is quite a trial topic because the sort of, the organisation of defence and the history that he's looked into, I think, is important. One of the things I used to do towards the end of my time in the MOD, particularly for incoming people, for new ministers and new chiefs, is to say you really need to understand quite a lot of the history of how we've got to where we are today if you're going to be able to manage this going forward. People tended to want to look at the things directly in front of them rather than looking back. And I think Andrew's historic survey has been valuable to kind of shine a light on how we've got to where we've got to. Second thing I'd congratulate him for is to being prepared to offer some recommendations, some suggestions. Again, as the department's strategy director, I spent a lot of my time with people talking to me about what was wrong with defence, and people can kind of come at this from many different angles, from inside and outside, and there was always a lot of criticism about where we were in the department at a point in time. Of practical, workable solutions, frankly, there was less. So I don't agree with every part of Andrew's prognosis, and I'll come on to that, but he has at least had the courage to put some ideas out there. On his ideas, I came quite late to this panel, so I was only able to sort of skim his conclusions. I think there's some very interesting ideas in his book about some of the things that could be done, and I'm sure we'll get onto those in terms of creating a defence staff, as it were, a kind of a purple staff from earlier in people's careers, which has kind of been a staple that has come back and back, talking about changing senior level ranks and so on for him to get to. I guess the point that I would come to, and where I think we might usefully steer this conversation this evening, which is to say, Andrew's landed this book right now, about halfway through the Defence Review that's going on. Quite separately, and of course before the Defence Review started, John Healey came out with a sort of high-level blueprint of his own back at the end of February. And I think in some respects, actually, maybe the interesting conversation we could have this evening would be the extent to which the proposals that Andrew is making in his book resonate with what John Healey is trying to achieve. Because, what we can be confident about is, Healey isn't going to pick up your book and say, yes, no, yes, no. He's launched his own initiative. So I think, Andrew, the extent to which the ideas, the principles in particular, that you're setting out in your book will dock with what the programme of defence reform that is underway would potentially be the most interesting and useful conversation for us to have.
My kick-off question that's a bit sharper would be, of your top sort of 4 or 5 recommendations for change, which do you think is top of your list is it, and perhaps you need to say a bit more about the idea of a defence staff, but what's the what are your half dozen recommendations that to make things a little better?
So I would pick out two, and given what I've just said, these are the two proposals that I think best cover off those issues around reducing the power and authority of the services. So the defence staff, not my idea. It was actually first floated back when the MOD was unified in the mid-60s. There was a paper written by Churchill's former Chief of Staff, Ismay and General Jacobs, who said that when you got to 2-star level in the service, you should leave your service and you should join a defence staff. My key proposal steals that idea, but actually brings it down. So in the army, when you get to full colonel, you leave your regiment and you join the general staff. So my proposal is that you actually do that across the whole of defence. You get to OF5, you get to captain, you get to group captain, you get to colonel, and you leave your service and you join the defence staff. From that point on, you are administered, you are promoted, you are managed totally from within the defence system. You clearly at times will have to go back to your parent service to do jobs within that service at a higher rank than OF5, but the majority of jobs that you do, and history shows that, when you get to OF5 above and above, are defence-related jobs. By doing that, you are reducing the power and the influence of the service on individuals. So to move through the starred ranks under that system, you would not be relying on your former service to promote you, which would allow you to think and act more in a defence manner rather than a single service manner. So that's the first issue. The second one actually is a little bit aligned with one of John Healy's points. So I agree that there should be a military strategic headquarters. But what I don't see is a pulling apart of the Department of State and military strategic headquarters and just leaving them in that building behind us. I would physically create a military strategic headquarters based on strategic command, but using the military strategic staff from that building as well. But those in the military will tell you that a headquarters is actually all about the commander and the units under command. So what units would you put under command? Well, I would actually put the services under command of that military strategic headquarters. So I would have a 4-star commander sat in that military strategic headquarters, and I would brigade under 3-star service chiefs the services and other points, CJO's organisation, for example, underneath that organisation. So you actually have a military strategic headquarters delivering that military effect, and a Department of State that is doing policy and governance. And the key reason for that, everybody focuses on the military strategic headquarters, but the important part of doing that is to free up space within your Department of State to govern defence activity. Because that's the key reason, in my view, why Levine didn't work, because nobody had the oversight of the activity that the single services were doing. Head office was not strong enough to do that. All of the knowledge was rusticated out to the services, and they got on and did what it was that they wanted to do. And I'm generalising slightly for effect here, but that's pretty much what happened. If you have an organisation that has the bandwidth and the strength to govern the activity below it, then that's another way of stopping the power and influence of the service. So those are the two main things that I would do, and I would do them both to tackle the issues that I raised at the start.
Thank you. I've looked through the book, and there are many other related proposals, and because I was involved as well in earlier efforts to bring these sort of ideas in, I do know the kind of opposition that they generate. I'll throw a slight curveball at you, but you remember, because it reminded me when you remember the past, that it was put to me, I didn't come up with it, but it was put to me that some senior civil servants objected previously to the idea of having a more coherent military structure within defence, because it would make the civil service less able to influence what's happened. When you had competing services, the civil service could come in and kind of referee and adjudicate. But I mean, I'm sure that's completely unfair, but I'll let you confirm that it's completely.
That might be the attitude of some civil servants. What I would do, I think, is kind of just come back on Andrew's two key proposals. So I think the first one, it's an idea that's been around for some time, as you say. One of these days we might give it a go. Whether amongst the plethora of other big ideas that are going to drop out of this review, this will be the time for it, I'm less sure. Where I think I would take issue with you, Andrew, is on the idea of separating out a military strategic headquarters from the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall. And I would take issue with that for the reason of, and I've worked at both ends of, I've worked in the Ministry of Defence, I've worked in the Northwood headquarters a couple of times in our permanent joint headquarters, so seen how the command and control of operations work at both levels. And I would see quite serious risk in dislocating the two functions, because the command and control of operations always happens in the context of the political circumstance and the debate that's going to be happening in Whitehall. So what is really going to be informing the judgments of the senior commanders are going to be what's happening as much over the road as is happening elsewhere. And the thought that you could kind of take that whole function and produce a sort of pure military headquarters in Northwood. We kind of did that with the PJHQ. We then doubled down on it and made it Joint Forces Command, Strategic Command. So it's a direction of travel. But having observed, military operations are innately political in the effect that they're trying to achieve. And I think, creating separate structures across the top of defence, I think would be difficult. As we get into sort of John Healy's proposals, I think what he's essentially trying to do, isn't it, is to reverse some part of the Levine proposal. So I think you and I, and probably he, would be consistent with this, that and having been around when Levine was being conceived and then introduced, I think most of us at the time thought this felt about right. This was about trying to take the single service commands out from the definition of the programme in the centre where too much time was being spent, I think, by common assent, and give them the authority to go and manage their services. And on that, that felt to me like a model that was and conceivably could still be right. So I'm perhaps less fussed than you are, Andrew, about the kind of, the whole kind of strength of the services. I think, the services will continue to exist in their own right, for sure. I think it is in our interest to have strong, powerful, independent services, led by thoughtful, strategic people. But I think what has gone wrong is in the interpretation. So rather than simply ask service commanders to go away and become responsible for commanding their activities, instead what happened is substantial replica planning staffs grew up in each of the command, such that they began to kind of take authority for some of the things that it had been agreed in the model should have been left in the MOD. So that would be my principal critique of what went wrong with the implementation of Levine. Nothing wrong with the idea, it was just overinterpreted. So I think what as I understand what Healy's trying to do, he's trying to bring that part of the kind of central direction and definition of defence back into the MOD. I think you and I would just differ in terms of, how and where it is done.
I suppose a central question would be that during the Levine period and with the Levine report, the exhortation was that people should think defence. I think that was the phrase. Now the exhortation, no, that clearly didn't happen. Yeah. And now the exhortation is one defence. That's the phrase that's being used by John Healy. So the question we all have is how does that, if that's a good thing to think, how do we generate it? But I think I should shut up and you've had enough to prompt your interest. So I can see a question already. If you could identify yourself and where you come from, then that would be terrific. And you maybe it's quite small, but I think a microphone's cool. Well, if you just say who you are, then we
Hello, I'm Luke Marchand. I'm not currently affiliated with anyone. I just finished a degree in military history at SOAS, and I come from Canada, so this is pretty relevant to where I'm from. I've got a double header with you that I'll try and keep very short. Firstly, unusual example, but I studied the Austro-Hungarian military in the First World War, and they had a central general staff that oversaw their structure, which was Byzantine, and it turned into something of a gentleman's club of its own. The Bottle Green boys who looked after each other overruled subordinate commanders and made procurement and force decisions that proved fairly disastrous for the services, but self-serving for them. What's the danger of defense becoming this pool of staff officers from all the services and becoming a super service of its own? Who referees that? And secondly, to what extent are we just rearranging deck chairs on the Bismarck, to mix metaphors? I mean, a huge problem with reforms is that the money isn't there, the people aren't there, the infrastructure isn't there. How much more can we do with less? At what point are we trying to fix processes when the problem is simply there's just not enough? It doesn't matter how you slice it, it's how much there is. Thank you very much.
Okay. So interestingly, one of the criticisms of the Canadian unification experiment was that it did exactly what you said in terms of the headquarters structure. And so you ended up with effectively career staff officers who, once they'd got into that organisation, never left it. So I absolutely recognise that there is the potential for issues there. It would have to be carefully managed. Personally, I don't think that is enough of a reason not to do it. The other point about budgets, 55 billion is quite a lot of money. And I think most people would, if they were, had a good hard look at it, would suggest that defence could do more with what it has. I think the argument that given the current situation in the world, it probably needs more over and above being able to do better with what it has. I think both of those arguments are correct. So yes, I believe defence does need more money, but I also believe that it can do a lot better with what it has. And part of the way that you do that is through reforming your processes and procedures. So I do think this is overdue.
A quick one on that latter point, which is to say, and maybe just first to pick up another point, another thesis of Andrew's, which is sort of, none of these defence reforms have ever worked. I'm not sure that's right or fair either, actually. At various stages, it has felt to me that, often after the end of defence reviews, when, policy programme, resources, commitments, budget are all in line, and people know what they're doing and are resourced to go and do it, then the organisation will work fairly well. The challenge, I think, with defence departments, and it's not just in the UK, it's the world over, is that they slip very quickly out of balance, usually within months, few or very few years, and so you're already into a muddle, in year 1, 2, and 3, and sort of you're reviewing your review really quickly. On organisation, it's it's not for nothing that we don't do this all that often, because this is a really complicated thing to do, and it's exceptionally disruptive as it's going on. There was a great quote I heard about kind of, you should do major reorganisations about as often as you should contemplate major surgery. And I think that, that sort of does feel about right for the same reason. So, it has been, 12 years since we did Levine. The thing that Healy is now trying to pull off is the next major piece of this. I think as it's relevant to your question, my reaction would be, this does feel like a slightly curious time to be trying to reorganise the department, just as you're in the middle of what the authors are describing as the most transformative defence review for 150 years. So you're potentially going to completely rethink how you're going to do defence. And yet Healy has kind of, set out his stall already by saying, here are 3 organisational changes that I'm going to effect to deliver it. The centralisation point, I think is a good one, because you would need a stronger centre to do this. Whether you need the NAD that he is contemplating, whether you need the military strategic headquarters, all the blurb that comes out sort of says these are preconditions to getting this done. I'm yet to be persuaded by that, I would say.
Okay, good question. Over here, catch my eye. But if other people with questions put their hands up, I'll try and remember.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Curtis, for your thesis. So just taking you right back to the meta point that you... Yeah, of course I can. Yeah, my name's Jamie Bennett from PA Consulting. I'm currently working as part of the into defence reform for some of the proposed NAD structure. So thank you for having me along this evening. So yeah, Dr. Curtis, thank you. So your thesis at the meta level, you were kind of lamenting defence reform, how it's failed to deliver, and you were quite clear in saying that you saw that there were 2 constituent parts to that. One of them being the failure of politicians to get involved at the correct level. You then went on to say that you think the USP for defence is either threatening to break things or break things. And just looping it back around, I'd just be really interested to hear your views on defence reform and One Defence, and of course some of the things we've spoken to there about NAD, and the idea that actually politicians are now trying to broaden that role of defence to think about One Defence as leveraging industry as part of deterrence, etc., and what you think that means for the future shape and kind of your thesis that you've put forwards as well.
So, I think you made some really good points there. I talk in the book about team defence, which is pretty similar, I think, to what John Healy is talking about. I don't go into a great deal of detail around activity outside defence, so i.e. bringing in industry, bringing in allies and partners, but I do recognise that is quite an important aspect of this. I think one of the issues around the political element is the loss of interest, but also it's the fact that politicians move on as quickly as they do. The average time, I think, for a defence secretary from 1964 to now is less than 2.5 years. Junior ministers last even less time in post. And the problem that you get is, and this is a Westminster problem, as soon as a politician understands their brief, they get moved on. And so you get this situation where the people who you want to oversee and to really make sure that these reforms are being delivered as planned, rather than as the people that are delivering them want them to be, that's part of the problem. Suddenly they're gone, because they've moved on, or there's been another general election. That's what happened in 1964. And that's a problem if you look in history, that the Canadians had it. The Germans have had it, where people have just tried to deliver reform and then the politician has moved on. So the way I would propose dealing with that would be to actually create a ministerial appointment as a Minister for Defence Reform and say, that is your job for the duration of this Parliament. You will not go anywhere else. You will not do anything else. You will focus on that, and that will be your activity. And it will be a lifed post in military parlance, And once that reform has been delivered, then you no longer need that, that political appointment. But I would nail it down because, in my view, unless you have that political oversight, you don't end up with the reform that you think you're aiming for. You end up with the reform that the people who are delivering it want to deliver. And those are never the same thing.
1, 2.
Oh yeah, my name's Chris Fennell. I found the opening statement around defence reforms fascinating. The latest defence reform, I'd argue, started last summer, so I led the first year's worth of defence design. And in doing so, the team had created 1,000 people from defence had come up with what the answer was. One of the things I find fascinating is defence is absolutely obsessed with discussions on structure. So I'll be interested from the two of you, and particularly the researchers, what is it going to take for defence to get over its obsession with structural debate and to get into what actual change and delivering a better outcome would look like?
Well, I'll go first by just reinforcing the point I made a moment ago that kind of surely the time to design the defence organisation that you want is beyond the point at which you have just figured out the kind of sort of defence that you want to have. I do, you know, as sort of professionally these days, I kind of go and help companies, countries actually, to kind of conduct exercises like these. And my point always to them is kind of, you know, do this first. I mean, I agree with you. I've always been mystified by the, you know, by the obsession of thinking that, you know, first thing you do is you change an organisation and then, you know, magic will happen. It doesn't. Usually organisational change, from my sort of, you know, slightly crass surgery point, it creates tension, it creates turmoil, and once you begin this thing, it's really hard to land it, as I think, you know, the MOD has found on defence design, because the Healy thing, of course, you know, is just the latest. As you well know, you know, there was a programme of defence design that was meant to be effectively done by the time he arrived. So you've now just got sort of, you know, initiative on top of initiative on top of initiative. My strong, you know, counsel advice would be almost to kind of, you know, you can't freeze it because he's committed himself to it. He just recommitted himself to it, whatever. But that doesn't mean that you need to complete it now. You could kind of leave the principles of this in place. You could focus on getting the defence review done. Then you'd know what sort of defence it is you're trying to manage. You could then tweak the organisational design. And I mean, the headline principles of this are set, but you could spend, they will spend an awful lot of time working on the fine detail of this, when I think they could sort of, you know, take a break, come back to it in the, you know, spring, summer, would be my suggestion.
Could I just press you a bit, Will? Yeah. Because, I mean, in a sense, there is a military strategic point, which is that the intention is to generate multi-domain integration. Yeah? And therefore the question is, I mean, I would observe it's easy to make a new policy because you just write it. Yeah? To put it into effect, you need things lower down. That includes organisational change. It may mean regulatory change, legal change in some cases, and it often needs cultural change in the organisation. So policy is quite, but we have a policy for multi-domain integration. Is the current system capable of delivering that efficiently and effectively?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I've written about some of this stuff and sort of, you know, charted the history of kind of, you know, from single services being, you know, the central powers, all the way through to the big thesis of, you know, jointry being the big idea, and multi-domain integration is simply, you know, it's the next step towards this. I think the answer, Trevor, is if there's a will to do it, if there is a will effectively to integrate the other two domains, namely space and cyber, into the overall operating model, yeah, it could be done even within existing structures. I mean, it's exactly to your point. You don't need to keep kind of redesigning the thing. You need behavioural change, you need leadership, you need clear direction setting and clear goal setting, and people to be sort of measured against it. I mean, it does dot with Andrew's point of kind of, you know, you need cultural change to affect this. You need to promote people who will be advocates for this, rather than people sort of, be advocates for it for a couple of years and then step out and go and do something different. But is it doable? I think it is doable.
To add a couple of points, in terms of the research, when it came to proposed changes, that was very much process driven. But the key point, as I said at the start, that the research threw up was the need to tackle those two blockers, for want of a better phrase, i.e. get the politicians more engaged and restrain the power and influence of the services. So how do you do that? Interestingly, Field Marshal Montgomery at the end of the Second World War said if you were building the British Armed Forces today, you would never start from the organisation that we've got, i.e. an Army, a Navy and an Air Force. He said that in 1945. And two of the organisational change white papers, the one immediately after the war in 46 and the one that delivered the unified MOD, both talked about unifying the services. Now, that's a very interesting subject if you talk about it within the military and everybody says, oh, Canada did that, it didn't work, they changed it back again. Well, they didn't. There is still, by law, only one Canadian Armed Forces. Even though they still operate as an Army, Navy and Air Force, there is still the Canadian Armed Forces. But it's telling that they're the only country that have tried it. So I guess where I'm getting to is the way that defence operates. I think the only way that you can tackle change in the way that the organisations recognise is to do an element of structural change. But I do believe that that's not the driver. The driver is the process. But I don't believe that you can solve those key problems that I talked about without some element of organisational change. So I believe you have to do it.
So,
my name is Nick Morris. I'm a retired logistician. I won't declare from which service in the debate we've had. I think a measure of how important and interesting this is that my question has changed 5 or 6 times while I've been listening to the debate. But is there not a fundamental issue in defence, which is the plethora of initiatives? Because that is what generates short-termism, people looking over their shoulder. No one would dispute that warfighting works well in the joint environment. Selection and maintenance of the aim is well held. In procurement, it is very different. And ideas abound. People latch onto an idea, they pursue it, they drop it, or they pursue it with a single-minded, relentless approach that doesn't discuss it. Isn't there a bigger issue over behaviours, particularly on the procurement side?
Yeah, absolutely. I was reading something around the SDR only today that was pointing out, we trust somebody of a certain rank to lead 110 soldiers into battle, but we won't let them hire their own vehicle to do a journey. Now, I've read something similar to that over the last 20 years, and yet we still won't let them do it. And the system, and I know there's an element of managing public money, and there are all sorts of checks and balances around that, but the fact remains that the trust that we give servicemen and women in delivering military effect is completely out of proportion to the trust that we give them in managing the business of defence, where we don't trust them at all. And the system doesn't trust, and so everything goes up and up and up, and what was done by a squadron leader 20 years ago is done by a group captain or an air commodore today, and it's only getting worse. So I do believe there has to be a fundamental reset of that. That is one of my proposals, that you do have to do that reset. How you tackle the specific procurement issues, I'm going to body swerve, simply because the book looked at the higher management of defence around the defence operating model. It specifically didn't cover procurement. Perhaps there's a book we need to talk about defence procurement as a follow-up.
Plenty of books on procurement reform. I was going to come at it from a slightly different angle, which was to say, I mean, I much agree with you on kind of, initiative overload, and it's kind of a variation of the point that you made, really. And the way that I would come at from this is, defence planning. I mean, when I was asked what I did for a career, I would say I was a defence planner. I was strategy planning. That was kind of the part of what I did. And the kind of realisation I got to towards the end of my time was kind of, strategic planning, good defence planning is really all about prioritisation. It's about, figuring out the things that you really, really need to do to change defence to get things done. And yet, if you counted up, and somebody did this, not me, if you counted up the number of different initiatives that were spread across the 3 white papers in 2021, so the Defence Command paper, the integrated review, and the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy, somebody said there was something like 268 different commitments that the government had made that, we are going to do, this and this and this and this. And, no organisation is capable of, delivering all of that in parallel. You then wait sort of 18 months and you do refreshes of 2 of those things, and you add another several dozen things that people say they're going to do. And tales out of school, seeing the MOD PUS not all that long ago, earlier this year, he was asking himself at that stage, I'm just kind of, slightly lost track on kind of, which of these things matters most, what are the things that are going to turn the dial, change the dial, if I do them, as against the things that are small and tactical. So insofar as I have one bit of advice, and I'm talking to the Defence Review team on this, is to say, guys, you need to really focus on what are the big things that you want done, because it's, it's easy to write a fancy white paper, I used to do it myself, and it can be persuasive and thoughtful and kind of, a good read, and it can be full of interesting sounding initiatives and things that you could do. Get to the end of it and ask yourself, which of those things are really going to make a difference and move defence in the direction it needs to go against the more dangerous and difficult, security environment we're in now. Because, perhaps just one point that Andrew made earlier, which is the context. I think it is fair to say that over time, politicians arguably have not taken, our politicians, the British public maybe hasn't invested in defence in the way it should. It feels to me like that is changing. The debate that we're having now is very different from the debate we were having even 5 and 10 years ago. The threat out there is real. The fact that the government is issuing sort of, guidance to citizens on kind of, what to do in the event of emergencies, as is happening in the Baltics and elsewhere. This is starting to get closer in. So I think, this is all going to start to matter a whole lot more quite soon. And that's why I think this review is really important, that we get this one right, that we identify the right initiatives rather than dozens and dozens of initiatives, and that, once we got it right, we then change our way back to the defence reform, to the defence organisational piece.
I'd come in with a question which relates to that, which is that when we look at the position of technology and where it's moving, what that's doing is, of the OODA loop, as it were, the observe, orientate and decide loops are becoming much more prominent, because if you get those right, the decide bit is relatively straightforward, whereas the act bit, as it were, the act pieces, have we got defence set up in such a way that information collection, people that understand information collection, understand, I'm not going to use the term AI, but understand data processing, understand what military operations are going to really, hang on, that's not really a core competence, it's not been a speciality. The Air Force has been about delivering kinetic effect, the Army and the Navy. Is that a driving force to make the Single Services Act in isolation, well, relative isolation, or prepare in isolation, that's probably a better phrase, prepare in isolation from each other? Is that an argument that comes into your consideration?
So I think there are 2 distinct areas in terms of that activity, and you can see an OODA loop within the delivery of military effect, on operations. And certainly, if you look at what MDI is trying to do, if you look at what the integrated operating concept is trying to do, and if you look at some of the lessons from Ukraine, you can see that, call it the warfighting aspect of defence, is recognising that problem and is doing something about it. All you have to do, as an example, is to look at some of the new intelligence fusion organisations, and that is inherently joint, and so that is focused on an integrated way of doing business. Is the same true managing the business of defence? I don't believe it is. I think some people are talking a good game in that space. I think some people are looking at what that means in terms of changing process, but I'm not sure that I have seen a great deal of evidence that suggests that the way elements of defence are focused on that problem in the delivering military effect space is replicated in the managing the business of defence space. And I think it absolutely needs to be.
There's nothing to add to that, Andrew. I mean, I think you've nailed that. I guess what I would say is that, this is definitely going to be a very prominent theme of what the people in the Defence Review are looking at the moment, because, if you can't integrate the data effectively, the war in Ukraine is showing us exactly that. That's going to be on the sort of, on the critical path into the future. And if you can't husband the resources of defence in the same way, speedily, much more effectively, because there's a pace thing that really hasn't come out of the discussion this evening. We just need to get quicker at the way that we're doing these things. I mean, this kind of the ponderousness of the whole defence reform effort. I mean, honestly, it's just been bloody going on for years. It kind of, we need to get better at this. We need to get quicker at this. We need to make decisions, and we need to get them implemented. Somebody over there's got a...
Last question at the back, I think.
Thank you. David Kilby, Strider Technologies, a US tech startup. That last series of answers and discussions I thought was really interesting. And my one observation is the pace with which defence understands and absorbs new technology is far too slow. The processes that are built into how defence understands and absorbs new technologies is far too slow. How would a defence reform programme look to get through those processes and get through that absorption issue? And would that, bringing together of the three services and bringing in civilians and industry together to resolve that problem, could that be the solution?
So if I go back to the body swerve I did previously with regard to procurement issues, a lot of what you're talking about is that process, which you absolutely will not find in my research. But in general, if you are looking at improving the efficiency of the business management of defence, that's effectively what I'm arguing. I'm suggesting that part of defence should be treated as much as possible as a business, and you should be applying business processes to that activity. The fact that you are still delivering a lot of those within a military construct can be problematic, but at the end of the day, you have got to be careful. The defence management tail cannot wag the warfighting dog. And what my research has suggested is that has happened on occasion. I think it happened in Germany after reunification, and I think it happened in Canada after the services were brought together. And you end up with an organisation that becomes too fixated on managing itself and not focused enough on it's raison d'etre, which is doing harm to the king's enemies and blowing up their stuff. So there's a balance, but I recognise that the balance is not in the right place at the moment. It has to shift. All I would say is you need to be careful not to shift it too far and thus impact on your reason for being, which is the delivery of military effect. And I know that's a bit of a cop-out, and for that I apologise.
Just a quick one. I mean, I completely recognise the point. When we'd finished the 2015 review, a group of us wrote a document that some of you might recall, the Defence Innovation Initiative, which was precisely designed to encourage, the best tech startup, the people who had the best tech to sort of, bring it in quickly. And defence is, we were quite pleased because we sort of, set out some high-level goals in that. I thought some quite clear priorities. Defence's reaction was very interesting because what happened, in no time at all, is in each of the services, people started to build their own, innovation hubs. So J-Hub in Strategic Command and Navy, and then it all became a bit distributed again. And then we had sort of, catapults and things breaking out all over the place. So the whole thing became messy. I think that what Robertson and Barons and Co will do is take a very hard look at that and ask how you can kind of aggregate that up further so that you don't allow this to slip back into kind of, you've got to go and pitch to the Navy for this and you've got to pitch to the Army for that. End with a slight advert, which is kind of it's the company that I now have spends quite a lot of time substituting for the fact that this is all in a bit of a mess at the moment because, companies like yours come to us and say, we don't know how to talk to the Ministry of Defence about this. You try at the top, it doesn't work. You try in the portals, it doesn't work. You need to get into the middle. So, one exhortation to Richard and the team will be kind of, there are loads and loads of really good companies out there with really, really good technologies who can help us do the sorts of things we've been talking to this evening, but only if they can find their way in, and, and we as the Ministry of Defence can see who they are. You as industry can kind of, bring the best ideas in, then you get a decent fit.
Last word.
Somebody quite wise once said, the biggest issue around a problem is recognising that you actually have one. I think defence has moved beyond that. I think generally defence recognises it has a problem that we can all help to solve. I go back to one of the points I made at the start. Some of the things that we've talked about, some of the details that we've talked about are very much a solution. They're not necessarily the solution. I think it's great that Will disagrees with some of the points that I've made. And if any of you are kind enough to read my book, I'm sure you will too. That's not a problem. As long as it drives you to inform the debate, and at the end of the day, all we're trying to do is make this organisation better than it is at the moment. And so if this helps to do that, then it will have been a success. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody to coming. There's a glass of wine upstairs. I must say, about 2/3 through this discussion, I was reminded of a book that Dick Evans wrote with a colleague when he was chief executive of BA Systems. And he talked about the problem. He said, the problem in BA Systems is we have 30,000 employees in the UK and none of them work for BA Systems because they all identified with Wharton or Portsmouth or wherever. And here we're sitting in a situation where we have, I don't know how many people are in the armed forces currently. It's about 150,000, 146,000. We've got 146,000 people in the British Armed Forces, and none of them work for the British Armed Forces. Because you ask them who they work for, they won't say the British Armed Forces. So that was a parallel which struck me. I think that, if anybody came in here thinking that the management of defence resources was straightforward, I'm sure you've changed your mind. Thank the two speakers very much. Thank you for coming, and have a glass of wine upstairs. Good.